September 1408. A small stone church on the Greenland coast. Two priests reading the bonds. A man named Thorstein Olafsson married a woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir, and a certificate was issued, and by every visible measure it was an ordinary wedding. It was also the last thing anyone ever heard from the Vikings of Greenland. A colony of up to 5,000 people, nearly 5 centuries deep, simply stopped existing. No bodies, no records beholds, no goodbye. When a missionary named Hans Egede arrived in 1721 expecting a thriving Christian settlement, he found abandoned farms and silent churches. For centuries, the explanation was the same. They were stubborn, they refused to adapt, they died of their own European pride. Then modern science began to read the bones, the soil, and the ivory itself, and what it found was not the story we had been telling at all. The man who built the colony was a killer. Eric Thorvaldsson, remembered as Eric the Red for the color of his hair and his temper both, had inherited the family problem before he ever saw Greenland. His father had been driven out of Norway for manslaughter and had dragged a young Eric west to Iceland to begin again. Beginning again did not take. Following a dispute over some borrowed wooden beams, Eric killed 2 of his neighbor's sons, and the Icelandic courts returned a verdict the Viking world rarely bothered with. 3 years of banishment. He had crossed a line even that world recognized. The direction of his exile was decided for him. East was the Norway his family was already banned from. South was open ocean. West was a rumor, 80 years old, of land glimpsed once by a sailor, blown off course, and never gone ashore. Eric sailed toward the rumor in 982. What he found first was not encouraging. The eastern coast of Greenland is a wall of ice and black rock, unbroken for hundreds of miles, a shore that announces itself as uninhabitable and means it. He pressed south, rounded the brutal cape that later mariners would name Farewell, and worked his way up the western shore. And there the land changed. The ice gave way to deep, sheltered fjords. Grass grew where grass had no business growing. Seals along the coast, seabirds overhead. It was not Iceland. It was not Norway. But it was enough. He spent the full 3 years of his sentence exploring it, naming places, finding the pockets of green that would become farms. Then he sailed back to Iceland with a plan that depended on convincing several hundred people to abandon everything and follow a convicted killer across the North Atlantic to a country none of them had ever seen. So he lied. He called it Greenland. The sagas say he chose the name precisely because people are drawn to a place that sounds green. It was the 10th century equivalent of an estate agent calling a freezing studio flat cozy. And it worked. In 986, 25 ships left Iceland packed with livestock and tools and roughly 500 hopeful settlers. Only 14 ships made it. Some turned back. Others were lost to the sea. The survivors raised 2 settlements along the southwestern coast, the larger near what is now Qaqortoq, the smaller some 300 miles north near modern Nuuk. Eric claimed neither. He took the finest land in the whole territory for himself, a sprawling estate at the head of a beautiful fjord, and called it Brattahlid. He built a great hall there. When archaeologists excavated the site, they measured it at 24 meters long. The man twice banished for killing had, in a single decade, made himself king of his own country, and the country he built had no business surviving. There were almost no trees, which meant no timber for ships or houses. There was virtually no iron ore, which meant no tools or weapons of their own making. Grain would not ripen reliably in the climate, which meant no bread without imports. The driftwood that washed onto the beaches was so precious that community leaders rationed it and forbade it from being burned for heat. For fuel, they cut the peat bogs. For walls, they stacked dry stone and packed it with animal fur against the cold. They made cheese and butter in the short summers, hunted seal and caribou along the coast, took fish from the fjords and birds from the cliffs, and when a whale washed up, it fed a settlement for weeks. It was workable. It was never comfortable. And yet within a single generation, these people had engineered a functioning Arctic farming society out of almost nothing. A thing that should not have lasted a decade. It lasted nearly 500 years. That endurance is the part worth holding on to. Because it was not built on Greenland's stone or Greenland's grass. It was built on one thing carried out of the northern sea every summer. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the colony had entered what can only be called a golden age. The population reached somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000, spread across roughly 500 farms in the eastern settlement and 100 more in the western. Churches rose, a cathedral rose. Greenland gained its own bishop. And the whole of it, the stone and the herds and the worship, rested on a single commodity carried out of the north every summer. Every year, hunting parties sailed for the grounds the Norse called the Nordersetur, far up the western coast near what is now Disco Bay. The journey was long and dangerous. The payoff was the most valuable raw material in medieval Europe. Walrus ivory. European traders at the time had no reliable access to elephant tusks from Africa, which made walrus the prestige material of an entire continent. It was carved into crucifixes, into the curved heads of bishops' croziers, into ornate book covers and ornaments for the houses of the wealthy, and the Greenlanders sat beside a seemingly inexhaustible supply of it, thousands of walrus hauled out along the rocky shores of the hunting grounds. For most of a century, archaeologists could only argue about how much of Europe's ivory came from Greenland. Then the bones were sequenced. In 2018, a team led by Bastian Starr and James Barrett analyzed the DNA inside walrus skulls, recovered from the ivory workshops of medieval Europe, and the answer was startling. By the 12th century, Greenland held something close to a monopoly. Most of the walrus ivory in Europe was coming from this one frozen colony at the edge of the world. The walrus gave more than its tusks. Its hide, extraordinarily tough and fully waterproof, was cut into rope strong enough to rig some of the largest ships in Europe. Beyond the walrus, the Greenlanders export fox fur and seal oil and polar bear pelts. Live polar bears were occasionally shipped south as royal gifts, bought by European kings for no reason beyond the status of owning one. Narwhal tusks were sold to a gullible elite who believed them to be the horns of unicorns. Gerfalcons, the magnificent white hunting birds of the Arctic, were worth more than their weight in gold, and to own one was a marker of immense rank. In return, ships from Bergen arrived carrying the things the colony could not produce for itself: iron tools, weapons, timber for boats and houses, grain for bread, communion wine, and altar candles for the churches. Without any of it, the colony could not function. And this is the part to hold on to, because everything that follows turns on it. The Greenland Vikings did not survive on Greenland's resources. They survived on one export commodity, sold to one trading partner, across one shipping route. 4.5 centuries of civilization, 5,000 people at the height of it, churches and a cathedral and a society that shipped unicorn horns to European kings, all of it resting on a single economic beam. And the people who built it seem to have understood, at some level, exactly how much weight that beam was carrying. Later accounts suggest that when the Greenlanders wanted a bishop of their own, they bought the right to one with walrus ivory. They paid their tithes to the church in it. The tusk was not simply their wealth, it was their tie to Europe, their proof of belonging to the Christian world, the thing they offered upward to remain part of something larger than a cluster of farms on the far side of the ocean. James Barrett put the danger of that arrangement plainly. The very thing that gave the society its resilience, he said, may also have carried the seeds of its vulnerability. A single commodity can build a civilization. It can also become the one thread that holds it above the water. And threads break, beams break. The question that haunted this colony for 600 years was what broke first, and why everyone who tried to answer it reached for so long for the wrong reason. For most of the 20th century, the reason was settled. It appeared in textbooks. It appeared in documentaries. It appeared in one enormously influential book, Jared Diamond's Collapse, which fixed the story in the public mind for a generation. The story was simple and satisfying, which is usually the first clue that a story is wrong. The Norse, it was said, were rigid Europeans who carried their farming traditions into the Arctic and refused to put them down. They clung to their cattle when cattle no longer made sense. They clung to their sheep when the grass stopped growing. They looked at the Inuit thriving all around them and refused to learn a thing from people they considered heathens and inferiors. And so they starved to death with their European dignity intact. The moral was neat and easy, a civilization killed by its own stubbornness. A cautionary tale about pride and the refusal to change. It was a compelling story. It was also, in nearly every part that mattered, false. The evidence that unseated it did not come from new documents, because none existed. It came from the bodies themselves. When a person eats, the chemistry of their food is written permanently into their skeleton. Carbon and nitrogen in particular leave a signature so specific that a trained researcher, working from a single fragment of bone, can read whether that person lived mostly on land animals, mostly on the sea, or somewhere in between. The technique is called stable isotope analysis, and across the last few decades, it has been applied systematically to Norse skeletons recovered across Greenland. The work of Jette Arneborg, Niels Linnerup, and Jan Heinemeyer, reading the bones of 27 Greenland Norse spanning the whole life of the colony, produced a result that did not merely revise the old story, it reversed it. In the earliest generations, the bones show exactly what the traditional narrative predicts. Roughly 80% of the diet came from land. Beef, mutton, dairy, the food of a European farming society transplanted whole into the Arctic. This is the starting point everyone expected, and it is where the old story assumed they stayed. Stubborn to the last. They did not stay. Across the following centuries, the ratio shifted, slowly at first, then faster, until by the final generations of the colony it had almost exactly inverted. Roughly 80% of the Norse diet was now coming from the sea, most of it seal. Read that again, because it is the whole point. A society that refuses to adapt does not quietly rebuild its entire food system from the ground up. That is not what stubbornness looks like. That is what a population in full, desperate, continuous transformation looks like. And the rest of the record says the same thing in a different language. Tools for hunting sea mammals multiply in the archaeology of the later phases. Clothing is reworked for the cold coast. Farmsteads consolidate and the settlements drift toward the shore, away from the failing inland pastures, toward the seal. Everything these people could change, they changed. They were not clinging to a dying European life out of pride. They were abandoning it as fast as the next generation could be taught to take a seal from a boat. So the comfortable story collapses, and a far more uncomfortable one stands up in its place. Because if these people were adapting as hard as a human community can adapt, changing what they ate and how they hunted and where they lived, then the old explanation has nothing left to offer. Stubbornness did not kill them. Pride did not kill them. Something else did. Something that did not care how fast they ran. And it forces the question the old narrative never had to answer, the question that the bones, by ruling out the easy answer, leave hanging in the cold air. If the Greenland Norse changed everything they were capable of changing and still vanished from history, then what was it they could not change? What broke a society that was doing, by every measure of its own resilience, everything right? The answer begins with the thing they could change least of all, the weather over their heads. Eric the Red's Greenland was not quite the lie it has always been called. When he made landfall on the western coast in 982, he sailed into a climatic window that climatologists now call the medieval warm period. For roughly 3 centuries, Arctic temperatures ran unusually mild. Grass grew in the fjords. Livestock could graze outdoors for meaningful stretches of the year. The sea lanes to Europe stayed open across most seasons. Eric's marketing was aggressive, but for the first few generations, the climate genuinely cooperated with it. The fantasy of Viking farming at the top of the world was, briefly, not a fantasy at all. Around the year 1300, the window closed. What came next is now known as the Little Ice Age, a long cooling that gripped the northern hemisphere for centuries. In Greenland, average annual temperatures fell by roughly a single degree. That number sounds far too small to matter. For a farming society already operating at the absolute outer edge of what was possible, it was enough to break the back of the whole enterprise. The mechanism was simple and unforgiving. Shorter growing seasons meant less hay. Less hay meant the livestock had to be kept indoors for longer each winter, eating through stored feed faster than the next short summer could replace it. Fewer calves survived. The herds shrank. Dairy production fell away. Every farm in the colony entered the same slow, compounding spiral at very nearly the same time. Pollen recovered from Greenland's lake sediments confirms it, recording the retreat of grasses and pasture vegetation across exactly this period. The agricultural base of the society was dying, and it was dying everywhere at once. And then the ground did something no one in the colony could have predicted or understood. The sea began to rise. This is the part that defies intuition, and for a long time it defied the researchers too. The world was getting colder. Ice was building, not melting. Every instinct says that a freezing climate should pull the sea down, lock more water into ice, drop the shoreline. In Greenland, the opposite happened, and in 2023, a team led by Marissa Boragin and Jerry Mitrovica at Harvard worked out why. As the Greenland ice sheet advanced during the Little Ice Age, 2 things happened at once. The sheer weight of the growing ice pressed the land downward, sinking the crust beneath the settlements, and the gathering mass of that ice exerted its own gravitational pull, dragging the surrounding ocean toward it and heaping the water higher against the coast. The ground was going down. The sea surface was coming up. They were moving toward each other. Their modeling found that relative sea level along the eastern settlement rose by as much as 3 meters across the span of the Norse occupation. The rise was gradual, measured in centimeters per generation, which is exactly why it took so long for the settlers to grasp what was being done to them. But the geography of the colony was uniquely defenseless against it. The best farmland, the flattest and most fertile ground, the home fields where livestock had grazed for generations, all of it sat low along the fjords. That was precisely where the water came in. The modeling describes shorelines retreating inland by hundreds of meters and a slow, pervasive flooding that would have forced the abandonment of coastal site after coastal site. So now, hold the full picture. The inland pastures were failing to the cold. The coastal pastures were drowning under the sea. The settlers were still farming, still hunting, still adapting exactly as the bones say they adapted. But they were adapting on a platform that was shrinking beneath them from 2 directions at once, and it was shrinking faster than any adaptation could keep pace with. The climate alone might have been survivable, given time. But the cold was only the first blow. The second was already on its way, and it came from 3,000 miles away, and it did not arrive as weather. It arrived as money. The single beam the whole colony stood on was the ivory trade, and it was already failing before the climate finished its work. Through the 13th and 14th centuries, 2 things happened to the market at once, and both were fatal. New trade routes opened into Russia, giving European merchants steady access to walrus hunted along the White Sea. At very nearly the same moment, expanded Mediterranean trade restored Europe's access to African elephant ivory, the material walrus had only ever been a substitute for. Both alternatives were cheaper. Both were more abundant. Both arrived by shorter, safer, less weather-dependent routes than anything that could be dragged out of the Arctic. The effect on Greenland was catastrophic and quiet. Prices did not crash in a single, ruinous season. They eroded across decades, a long, slow bleed that never gave the colony a clear moment to respond to. The work of Bastien Starr and James Barrett found that walrus ivory imports to Europe become hard to trace at all after 1400. The one lever that had purchased 4 centuries of iron and timber and grain and weapons simply stopped working. And here the science added something the colony itself may never have understood. A later study of those same walrus skulls, traced through the workshops of medieval Europe, found that over time the tusks were coming from smaller animals and from further and further north. That is the signature of a population being hunted out. The Greenlanders were not just losing the market, they were exhausting the walrus, sailing longer and more dangerous distances each year to bring back less. The hunting parties still went, the tusks still came. But the animals were thinning, the prices were falling, and the colony had nothing else to sell. Then, in 1348, the Black Death reached Norway. It is important to be honest about what the evidence does and does not show, because good science states its limits plainly. There is no archaeological or genetic trace that the plague itself ever reached Greenland. The distance, the cold, and the thinning shipping traffic may simply have spared the colony from infection. It did not matter. Greenland had spent 400 years building its entire relationship with the outside world around a single trading partner, and that partner was Bergen. Across the winter of 1349, in the space of roughly 6 months, the plague killed an estimated 60% of the Norwegian population. The shipping families, the merchant houses, the generational trading relationships that Greenland had spent centuries cultivating, all of it was gone inside half a year. The Norway that survived was not going to resume transatlantic voyages on any timeline that mattered. Every surviving hand was needed at home. Every port had lost its sailors. For a distant colony that had never once been anyone's strategic priority, the plague was not a near miss. It was the permanent severing of the one line that held the colony to the world. The church was the second line, and it went next. In 1378, the last resident bishop of Greenland, a man named Alf, died in the eastern settlement. No replacement was ever sent. The papal records contain a scattering of later documents that discuss the idea of dispatching a new bishop, treated more and more as a theoretical question about a diocese no one in Rome could actually reach. The institution that had tied Greenland to Christendom for nearly 4 centuries quietly let it go. This is the configuration the modern evidence forces into view. The colony did not die of one thing. It died because 3 separate load-bearing beams broke inside a single lifetime. The climate that had made farming possible, the market that had made imports possible, the trading partner that had made contact possible. Any one of those losses, on its own, might have been survived. The 3 together could not be. And while the Norse were losing all 3, another people had been moving steadily toward them. People who, in this new and freezing world, had every advantage the Norse had lost. While the Norse had been building their farms and their churches, another people had been crossing the top of the world to meet them. The Thule, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, had been migrating east across the Canadian Arctic for centuries, following the seal and the whale, expanding into territory once held by an older people called the Dorset. By the 14th century, they had reached the northern edges of the Norse world. 2 civilizations, arriving at the same coast from opposite ends of the earth. For a time, they met as traders. Norse metal goods have been recovered from Thule archaeological sites scattered across the Arctic, carried north through contact that began, by every sign, in peace. Two peoples on the same shore, exchanging what each had that the other wanted. Then, in 1379, the Icelandic annals record an attack on the eastern settlement. The Norse called the attackers Skraelings, the word they used for all the indigenous peoples of the region. 18 men were killed. No surviving record tells us what happened at the western settlement, but the archaeology is not silent. Farmsteads burned. Possessions left where they lay. The abandonment looks hurried rather than gradual, the signature of a population that left quickly and did not come back. And here the old story reaches for its most comfortable image. Primitive raiders falling upon a dying civilization. Spear and stone against European steel. It is a tidy picture, and it has the cause and effect exactly backward. The Thule were not primitive. They were the opposite. They were a people whose entire way of living, their clothing, their diet, their housing, their hunting, their travel, the whole architecture of their society, had been refined across thousands of years for precisely the Arctic conditions that were now overwhelming the Norse. They hunted from kayaks, swift and silent on the water, a technology the Greenlanders had no equivalent for and never developed. They took seal with toggling harpoons engineered to lock beneath the skin, a tool more efficient than anything in the Norse arsenal. They sheltered through the winter in dwellings that held heat far better than dry stone walls packed with fur. Where the Norse had spent 4 centuries trying, with enormous effort, to bend a European farming life around an Arctic coast, the Thule had simply been Arctic from the beginning. This is the cruelty buried in the timeline. The colder the world became, the more decisively it favored the people built for the cold. Every change in the climate that pushed the Norse closer to the edge pushed the Thule further into their advantage. The sea ice that closed the Norse hunting routes was the ice the Thule hunted across. The seal that the Norse were learning desperately to depend on was the animal the Thule had built an entire civilization around taking. The two peoples were not running the same race on even ground. The Norse were adapting as hard as a human community can adapt, and they were still losing by default to a population that did not have to adapt at all because it had never needed to. So set the contact aside from the question of blame, because the bones in the annals cannot tell us the full shape of what passed between these peoples, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Perhaps there was violence the records only glimpse. Perhaps there was competition for the same shrinking coast and the same retreating seal. What the evidence makes clear is narrower, and it is enough. The Norse were not destroyed by a lesser people. They were outmatched, quietly and structurally, by a people better made for the world both of them now had to share. A world that was turning, season by season, into the Thules and away from the Norse. The climate was failing them. The market had abandoned them. The church had let them go. And now the very ground they had farmed was passing into the hands of those who could live on it. There was very little left to lose. The end, when it came, made almost no sound at all. September 1408. A small stone church on the Greenland coast. 2 priests, a certificate, an ordinary wedding. We started there, and now we know what it was. Not a beginning. The last light of a colony already going dark. The Greenland Norse did not die of pride. They changed what they ate. They changed how they hunted. They changed where they lived. They changed everything a people can change. What they could not change was the climate beneath their feet, the market across an ocean, the walrus they had hunted thin, and the plague in a city they had never seen. They did everything right by the measure of their own resilience, and they lost anyway. The bones remember it. The isotopes remember it. The empty farms remember it. We only needed the tools to read it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We cover the cases history got wrong.